There are certain things that tie a family to its land, subtle reminders that stretch across generations and keep stories alive without words. For my family, that legacy stood tall in the middle of our front yard, a massive oak tree nearly 50 years old. My grandfather planted it when he first moved into the neighborhood, long before modern developments, manicured lawns, and pristine sidewalks came into play. Back then, the area was still a quiet suburb with open yards and families who actually knew each other. Over the years, the oak grew tall and strong, its roots spreading deep into the soil and its branches casting wide shade across the lawn. The tree was more than wood and leaves. It was a living archive of our history. My grandfather used to hang a tire swing from one of its sturdy branches when my father was a boy. Later, my father carved his initials into the bark as a teenager, a faint marking that was still visible if you knew where to look. For me, the tree had been a fortress, a reading nook, and the centerpiece of countless childhood summers spent beneath its branches. Now, as an adult, inheriting the home after my parents moved away, it felt like I was also inheriting the responsibility of protecting that symbol of our family's story. For years, the tree stood peacefully in the yard, admired by passers-by, often serving as a marker when people gave directions. But peace never lasts long when someone new moves into the neighborhood, especially when that someone has the unmistakable traits of a busybody, an overbearing sense of control, and a complete disregard for boundaries. That someone was Karen. She moved into the house next door barely 6 months ago, and from the start, she had made her presence known. The kind of neighbor who measured her lawn every morning to ensure it was exactly 2 inches tall. Karen quickly became infamous for nitpicking the smallest details around the block. Trash bins not aligned perfectly on pickup day, holiday lights put up too early, or cars parked slightly over the curb. Nothing escaped her scrutiny. To her, every little thing seemed like a violation of some unwritten rule she alone had drafted. It was only a matter of time before her eyes landed on my grandfather's oak. At first, it started subtly. I noticed her standing on the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, glaring at the tree. Sometimes she would pace around, as though measuring the shadow it cast on her lawn. A few times, she even took pictures with her phone, circling around as if she were gathering evidence. I brushed it off as her being nosy, but in truth, there was a growing unease in my chest. Karen was not the type to let things go quietly. The first official sign of trouble came in the form of a neatly typed note slipped under my door. It was written in overly formal language, the kind that tried to sound polite but dripped with condescension. The letter claimed that my tree was encroaching upon her property line, that the falling leaves were causing excessive cleanup on her lawn, and most outrageously, that the tree itself was posing a danger to the neighborhood because of its size. She ended the letter by demanding I take immediate action, specifically to cut the tree down, cut it down. The demand hit me like a slap. The oak wasn't just a tree. It was a living monument to my family. The thought of chopping it down to appease a neighbor's whims was unthinkable. Still, I knew better than to respond in anger. I ignored the note at first, assuming her tantrum would burn itself out. But Karen was not the type to give up. Days later, she confronted me in person, standing in front of the tree as though staging a protest. Her hands were firmly planted on her hips, her voice carrying across the street as she lectured me about responsibility and community safety. Neighbors passing by slowed down to watch the scene unfold, some shaking their heads knowingly. I didn't bother to argue. There was no reasoning with someone like her. Instead, I calmly reminded her that the tree was healthy, sturdy, and well within my property line. That should have been the end of it, but for Karen, it was only the beginning. What started as complaints soon turned into calls. First, to the local homeowners association, where she filed multiple grievances. The HOA, used to her antics, dismissed her concerns since the tree posed no violation of community rules. Then she escalated further, contacting the city's code enforcement office. Inspectors came out, looked at the oak, and found nothing wrong. In fact, they complimented its condition. Every official channel she pursued ended in the same conclusion. The tree was perfectly legal, perfectly safe, and untouchable. Each rejection only seemed to fuel her determination. I began to see her pacing her yard late at night, staring at the oak as though plotting her next move. The neighbors started whispering, some amused, others irritated. For them, Karen's crusade against the tree was just another chapter in her long list of neighborhood drama. But for me, it was becoming personal. I couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just about leaves or shadows or property lines. For Karen, the oak symbolized something she couldn't control, a defiance of her imagined authority. And for me, it symbolized the legacy of my family, a legacy I wasn't about to surrender. As fall rolled in and the oak shed its golden leaves, I braced myself for the storm that was surely coming. Karen had declared her war, and though she had failed in her first attempts, I knew she wasn't finished. Somewhere deep down, I had the unsettling feeling that she was preparing for something bigger, something more underhanded. And I was right, because before long, Karen's obsession with the tree would escalate beyond petty complaints and phone calls. She was about to cross a line she couldn't uncross, one that would turn the entire neighborhood, and even the city itself, against her. The first real battle of this war was about to begin. Karen's persistence was not merely irritation, it was obsession. What had started as glares and complaints quickly transformed into a campaign, one she seemed determined to win at any cost. The oak tree was no longer just an inconvenience in her eyes. It was an enemy, and like all enemies, she believed it needed to be destroyed. The first escalation came quietly, almost deceptively so. One morning, as I stepped outside to collect the newspaper, I noticed bright orange paint sprayed along the ground at the edge of my property. Fresh lines marked the soil, as though someone had tried to redraw the boundary. It didn't take long to realize who was responsible. Karen had gone so far as to hire a private contractor to measure the property lines, apparently in hopes of proving that the oak extended into her yard. But her plan backfired. The surveyor's report came back in my favor, showing that the oak was planted well within my lot. The report even included the history of the neighborhood's development, confirming the tree's age and placement. Yet, instead of accepting defeat, Karen doubled down, insisting that the tree's branches hanging over her side counted as an invasion of her property rights. She began speaking loudly about trespassing branches, to anyone who would listen, as though the oak itself had committed a crime. Neighbors rolled their eyes, but Karen didn't care. She was relentless. Within weeks, I started receiving anonymous notes in my mailbox, each one typed, each one demanding that I do the right thing and remove the tree before something bad happened. The notes were unsigned, but the tone was unmistakably hers. I kept them as evidence, but I refused to be intimidated. Then came the more public displays. Karen took her grievances online, creating long posts in the neighborhood's social media group. She uploaded pictures of the oak, circling its branches in red as if she were presenting evidence in a criminal trial. She called it dangerous, unsightly, and even a threat to property values. She claimed the falling acorns were damaging her car, the leaves were clogging her gutters, and the shade was preventing her grass from growing properly. Her posts stirred up attention, but not the kind she wanted. Most neighbors responded with sarcasm or outright mockery, defending the oak as a beautiful, historic part of the community. Some even called it a landmark. Karen's rants only seemed to solidify her reputation as the neighborhood nuisance. But that didn't stop her. It only made her more desperate. The desperation came to a head one Saturday morning when I woke to the sound of machinery. At first, I thought it was routine construction somewhere down the street. But when I stepped outside, I froze. Karen had hired a tree removal service. A massive truck was parked along the curb, its crew already unloading chainsaws and preparing ropes. Karen stood proudly at the edge of her driveway, arms folded as though she were orchestrating a victory. My stomach sank. She hadn't asked me, hadn't received any approval. She had taken it upon herself to destroy the oak without permission. I rushed forward, demanding to know what was happening. The workers explained that they had been hired to remove an unsafe tree. But when I pointed out the property lines and the lack of any permits, they hesitated. They asked Karen to produce documentation. She waved her hands dismissively, insisting she had it covered. Of course, she didn't. The standoff ended when I called the police. Officers arrived quickly, speaking with both the workers and Karen. The workers, realizing they had been misled, packed up and left immediately. The officers gave Karen a stern warning about trespassing and unauthorized property damage. But Karen didn't back down. Instead, she accused me of endangering the neighborhood and declared that she would take this higher. For the first time, I realized just how far she was willing to go. In the days that followed, Karen filed formal complaints not only with the city again, but also with the county. She scoured ordinances, digging for anything she could twist into a justification for cutting down the oak. When nothing supported her claims, she began showing up at city council meetings, speaking during public comment sessions about the menace growing next door. It was almost surreal watching one woman dedicate her entire existence to destroying a single tree. Neighbors who once ignored her now started to get annoyed. The constant drama disrupted the peace of the street. People whispered about her at block parties, rolled their eyes when she walked by, and avoided her rants in the online forum. But Karen seemed oblivious. In her mind, she was a crusader on a righteous mission. And then, she made her boldest move yet. One night, I noticed strange activity near the base of the oak. Fresh cuts had been made along the bark, shallow but intentional. Someone had tried to weaken the tree. The marks were low, hidden behind shrubs, as though meant to go unnoticed. It was clear sabotage. My heart sank, not only from anger, but from the realization that this wasn't just about harassment anymore. Karen had crossed into dangerous territory. I documented everything, taking pictures and filing a police report. The officers agreed it looked like tampering, though without direct proof, no charges could be filed immediately. Still, the evidence was piling up, and unbeknownst to Karen, her reckless actions were about to trigger consequences far beyond anything she imagined. Because what she didn't know, what she never even considered, was that the oak was not just any tree. It wasn't just mine, and it wasn't just old. It had been recognized years ago by the city under its Heritage Preservation Ordinance. My grandfather's oak was protected by law, officially registered as a heritage tree due to its age, size, and historical significance. And by targeting it, Karen was about to find herself in a battle she could never win. The tide of the story was shifting. The war she had started was about to turn against her. The neighborhood had already grown weary of Karen's antics, but the day the city became directly involved, everything changed. What Karen thought was simply her personal crusade against an inconvenient tree quickly escalated into something she was entirely unprepared for. After discovering the sabotage marks along the bark, I submitted my photos and reports not just to the police, but also to the city's Department of Urban Forestry. They were the ones who managed the registry of heritage trees. Within days, an inspector was dispatched to evaluate the oak. When he arrived, clipboard in hand and a badge pinned to his chest, Karen immediately stormed outside, eager to plead her case once more. She didn't realize she had just invited the wrong audience. The inspector circled the oak, his practiced eye taking in every detail. The size of the trunk, the spread of the branches, the overall health of the tree. He noted the carving my father had made decades ago, still faintly visible. He carefully examined the suspicious cuts near the base, his frown deepening with every glance. Finally, he turned to Karen, who stood impatiently on her driveway, arms crossed, waiting for validation. Instead, he informed her that she had not only been wrong from the start, but dangerously so. The oak, he explained, was protected under city law as a heritage tree. Removing it, damaging it, or even tampering with its roots or branches required a lengthy permit process and official approval. And because it had been registered decades ago, any attempt to interfere with it without city authorization was considered a violation, a serious one, often resulting in heavy fines. Karen's face turned pale, though she tried to hide it behind indignation. She argued, complained, and accused me of lying about the tree's status, but the inspector had the records in hand. He calmly explained that her complaints were unfounded. The oak was not a nuisance, nor a danger, but a valuable part of the city's ecological and cultural history. For the first time, Karen's power was stripped away. She wasn't dealing with an HOA she could bully, or a group of neighbors she could annoy into silence. She was dealing with the law, but Karen, in her stubbornness, refused to accept defeat. Instead of backing down, she shifted tactics. Within weeks, she had hired a lawyer, filing claims that the oak was hazardous and interfered with her quiet enjoyment of her property. Her lawyer sent letters to the city, demanding they reassess the tree's safety. The city complied, sending another team to evaluate it. They used specialized equipment, testing the strength of the trunk, inspecting the branches, and scanning the roots. Their conclusion was unshakable. The tree was healthy, stable, and posed no risk. In fact, the arborist praised the oak as one of the best maintained heritage trees in the district. Karen's claims were officially dismissed, but the story didn't end there because during the inspections, the city also took note of the sabotage cuts at the base of the tree. Their arborist confirmed the marks were man-made, deliberate attempts to weaken the structure. The inspector documented everything, attaching it to his report. What Karen had brushed off as overblown suddenly became potential evidence of criminal damage to protected property. The city launched an investigation. Notices were sent out, interviews conducted, and neighbors were asked if they had seen anything suspicious. Several recalled Karen lurking near the oak late at night. Others remembered her ranting publicly about taking matters into her own hands. While no one had witnessed her directly with a tool in hand, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Soon, Karen found herself under a different kind of scrutiny, not just from the neighbors she had alienated, but from officials who were far less forgiving. When word spread that damaging a heritage tree could carry fines of thousands of dollars per incident, and in some cases, even misdemeanor charges, Karen's bravado started to crumble. Yet still, she clung to her narrative, insisting she was the victim, that she was only protecting her rights as a homeowner. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very laws she had tried to twist against me were now poised to crush her instead. The tension on the street was palpable. Neighbors who once avoided Karen now openly watched her downfall unfold, whispering to one another as inspectors came and went. Some even took quiet satisfaction, knowing her endless meddling was finally catching up to her. Others shook their heads in disbelief, amazed that one woman's obsession with a tree had spiraled so far out of control. As winter approached, the oak stood tall and unshaken, its bare branches stretching proudly against the gray sky. For me, it was more than just relief. It was vindication. My grandfather's legacy had weathered storms before, and now it had withstood the pettiness of a neighbor's wrath. But Karen's story wasn't over. The city had yet to issue their final decision, and Karen was not the type to accept reality gracefully. She still had cards she thought she could play, still clung to the belief that somehow, someway, she could win. What she didn't realize was that the more she fought, the deeper she was digging her own hole. And soon, the city's decision would arrive in her mailbox, carrying consequences she never saw coming. The war she started was finally reaching its breaking point. The envelope arrived on a cold, windy morning, its official seal stamped clearly on the front. It was from the city's Department of Urban Forestry and Code Enforcement, a combination that meant only one thing: the investigation had concluded. While most people would open such a letter in private, Karen was not like most people. She tore into it right there in her driveway, her hands trembling more with rage than nerves, the paper fluttering in the breeze for all to see. Neighbors, drawn by curiosity, peeked from windows or stepped outside under the pretense of routine chores. They all knew what the letter meant. The entire block seemed to hold its breath. Her reaction was explosive. Karen's voice rose in shrill protest, echoing down the street as she read. The verdict was clear. The oak tree was to remain untouched, fully protected under heritage law. More importantly, the evidence of tampering had been deemed intentional damage, a violation carrying a fine. Not just a small fine, but several $1,000s. The city cited her actions as reckless endangerment of protected property, with warnings of further penalties if any additional interference occurred. For once, Karen's confidence cracked. She clutched the letter as though it had betrayed her, her face flushing red as she sputtered accusations of corruption, bias, and conspiracies. But the words meant nothing. The verdict was official, final, and unshakable. By evening, word had spread across the neighborhood. Karen had not only lost her battle, but had been fined heavily in the process. For many residents, it was a moment of poetic justice. For years, they had endured her constant nitpicking, her unending complaints, and her self-appointed authority. Now, the city had delivered the punishment they had long wished she would receive. Still, Karen wasn't finished. Not in her mind. Instead of quietly accepting her punishment, she launched into a new phase of defiance. She began appealing to anyone who would listen: the HOA, city council members, even local journalists. She painted herself as a victim of bureaucratic overreach, a homeowner unfairly burdened by an obsolete tree. She claimed her health was suffering, her property rights violated, her quality of life destroyed. But the neighborhood had changed. Where once some might have sympathized with her persistence, now there was only fatigue. Her voice no longer carried weight, it carried annoyance. Her public rants in the community forum drew laughter rather than outrage. Her flyers slipped into mailboxes were tossed away unread. The more she shouted, the less anyone cared. Meanwhile, the oak stood strong, untouched, and protected by law. Its branches reached outward like arms spread in victory, its roots anchored deeply in soil that no amount of Karen's complaints could unsettle. But Karen's battles had left scars. The cuts she, or someone under her instruction, had made at the base of the trunk were being treated by the city's forestry team, who applied sealants and protective measures to ensure no lasting damage. They documented every step, and those records were now permanently attached to the violation under Karen's name. The fine wasn't just a one-time penalty. It was now part of her property's file, a black mark that future buyers or officials could see. Financially, the blow was harsh. Thousands of dollars drained from her pockets for a fight she had started and lost. Worse still, the city made it clear that if further tampering occurred, the penalties would escalate into criminal charges if necessary. Karen had backed herself into a corner, but rather than step down, she lashed out more wildly. She started leaving passive, aggressive signs on her lawn, aimed squarely at me. "Respect your neighbors," read one, in bold black paint. Another declared, "Unsafe trees kill homes." Each sign was met with smirks and quiet laughter from those passing by. Instead of rallying support, she only deepened her own isolation. The final straw came when Karen tried to shift blame. She filed a counter-complaint, accusing me of negligence and demanding the city force me to remove the oak for safety reasons. But by then, officials had grown tired of her antics. Her claim was swiftly dismissed, and she was warned that continued frivolous complaints could result in further penalties. For the first time, Karen seemed trapped in a reality she couldn't manipulate. The law was not on her side. The neighbors were not on her side. Even the HOA, which had once tolerated her nitpicking, had distanced itself, citing her as a disruptive presence rather than a constructive one. And yet, even as her influence crumbled, she still glared at the oak, as if sheer hatred could topple it. The tree, however, did not care. It had survived storms, decades of seasons, and even an attempted attack. It stood rooted, steady, and immovable, a silent witness to the unraveling of the woman who sought its destruction. The neighborhood now buzzed with anticipation. Everyone wondered, would Karen finally accept defeat, or would she push further, dragging herself into even deeper trouble? The answer came sooner than anyone expected, because while the fine had humbled her briefly, her resentment festered. And when resentment mixed with desperation, Karen was bound to make her most reckless move yet. By the time spring returned, the oak had already begun to heal from the sabotage marks carved into its bark. New growth stretched toward the sky, leaves budding in rich green clusters, as if nature itself was determined to showcase the tree's resilience. For me, it was a comforting sight, a living reminder that strength often comes from simply enduring. For Karen, however, spring brought only bitterness. The fine had bruised her finances, the ridicule of neighbors had shattered her pride, and the city's official verdict had left her with no leverage. But rather than learn humility, she stewed in resentment, fixated on the belief that she had been wronged. The oak became more than just an enemy in her mind. It became a symbol of her humiliation, and Karen was not the type to forgive symbols. At first, her tactics seemed more passive. She kept up her signs and online rants, even though they drew little more than mockery. She paced her driveway, glaring at the oak as if sheer willpower might bring it down. Neighbors grew accustomed to her mutterings and tantrums, treating them as background noise. But behind closed doors, Karen was plotting. The desperate gambit revealed itself one humid night in early May. I woke around midnight to a faint buzzing sound, like machinery. At first, I thought it was a distant lawnmower, but when it didn't fade, I looked outside. There, illuminated by the glow of her porch light, was Karen herself, standing near the base of the oak with an electric saw in her hands. She was cutting into the tree. The scene was surreal. In the silence of the night, sparks occasionally flickered from the blade as she pressed it against the bark. She was frantic, her movements jerky and unstable, like someone consumed by obsession. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and called the police. By the time officers arrived, Karen had managed to carve a shallow, jagged gash into the trunk. She stood there, breathless and trembling, the saw still clutched in her hands. When the police confronted her, she screamed about her rights and accused me of endangering the neighborhood. But her words fell flat. This was no longer a petty complaint. This was destruction of protected property, caught in the act. The officers confiscated the saw, placed Karen in handcuffs, and read her rights as neighbors gathered in the street. Porch lights flicked on one by one, and people watched silently as the woman who had once tried to dictate the rules of the block was led into a squad car. For some, it was shocking. For others, it was the inevitable conclusion to months of escalating behavior. The aftermath was swift. The city added new charges to Karen's record: attempted destruction of a heritage tree, trespassing, and violation of prior warnings. The fines skyrocketed, now totaling tens of thousands of dollars. Worse still, the possibility of criminal charges loomed, with prosecutors reviewing the evidence. The oak had become more than a neighborly dispute. It had become the center of a legal battle that Karen could never win. And yet, even facing such dire consequences, she remained defiant. At her court hearing, she stood before the judge and insisted she was protecting the neighborhood from a danger nobody else would admit. Her words only hurt her case, painting her as unhinged rather than reasonable. The judge not only upheld the fines but also issued a restraining order, forbidding her from approaching the oak or setting foot on my property again. The neighborhood, meanwhile, seemed almost jubilant. For the first time in years, people felt free from her constant surveillance and harassment. Conversations that once revolved around her complaints now shifted toward relief. Children played outside without her scolding glances. Families decorated their lawns without fear of her letters. The street, in a way, had been liberated. But Karen, stripped of her authority and drowning in debt, withdrew into isolation. Her once perfectly trimmed lawn grew patchy. Her blinds stayed drawn. The same neighbors who once humored her now avoided her completely. Where she had once stood proudly in her driveway, dictating her vision of order, she now lingered in shadows, glaring silently at the oak from behind her curtains. The oak, meanwhile, thrived. Specialists treated the new wound from Karen's saw, applying protective sealants and supports to ensure the tree's health. Their reports reassured me that the damage, while unsightly, was superficial. With proper care, the oak would endure. And it did. Its leaves flourished, its branches stretched wider, and its roots grew ever deeper. The contrast was striking. The tree, once under attack, was stronger than ever. Karen, once full of bluster, was diminished and forgotten. Still, there was one final chapter to this story. Because Karen's war against the oak had not only destroyed her reputation, but also set in motion consequences that would outlast even her stay in the neighborhood. And those consequences would come to light sooner than anyone expected. The weeks that followed Karen's midnight arrest marked the quietest the neighborhood had ever been. The familiar tension, the constant bickering, the accusatory notes, the HOA complaints vanished overnight. What remained was an eerie stillness around her house, as though the air itself refused to carry her voice anymore. At first, many assumed Karen would return to her old habits, standing defiantly in her driveway or posting online rants. But something had shifted. With fines piling up, a court record attached to her name, and her reputation shattered beyond repair, she no longer had an audience. Every word she tried to speak fell into silence. Every accusation bounced back at her. The queen of nitpicking had been dethroned, her crown nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors. The oak tree, on the other hand, became a symbol of triumph. Where once it had been the subject of controversy, now it was admired with renewed appreciation. Families stopped during evening walks to point it out, telling their children about the 50-year old heritage tree that had outlasted storms, decades, and even a neighbor's wrath. Neighbors began hosting gatherings in their yards, often within sight of its sprawling branches, as if the oak itself had become a guardian of peace for the community. The city, too, recognized the story. After the incident, officials placed a small plaque at the base of the tree, officially marking it as a protected heritage site. The plaque bore a simple inscription: "This oak, planted over half a century ago, stands as a symbol of resilience and history." It was a gesture that honored not only my grandfather's legacy, but also the tree's role in uniting the community against one person's obsession. Karen, meanwhile, slipped further into decline. The financial burden of the fines grew unbearable, and her attempts to appeal were repeatedly rejected. Rumors spread quietly. She had put her house up for sale, desperate to escape the mounting costs and the glares of neighbors who now saw her not as an authority figure, but as a pariah. Prospective buyers came and went, but word of the heritage tree, the fines, and the court records traveled quickly. Offers were low, and each time her pride prevented her from accepting them. Her once pristine yard fell into disarray. The grass grew long, weeds crept along the edges, and the signs she had once displayed with bold defiance faded in the sun until their words were unreadable. Where she had once fought to impose perfection, neglect now painted the clearest picture of her downfall. For me, life settled back into its rhythm. I tended to the oak with renewed care, following the city's guidelines for heritage preservation. On quiet evenings, I would sit beneath its branches, remembering my grandfather, my father, and the childhood moments I had spent in its shade. The oak had always been more than just a tree, but now, it was also a reminder of what it meant to stand firm in the face of unreasonable demands. The neighborhood slowly moved on, but the story of Karen's obsession lingered as a lesson. New families who moved in were told about the tree war, and children pointed to the oak with wide eyes, retelling the tale in exaggerated whispers. The oak was no longer just a landmark. It was folklore woven into the fabric of the community. Eventually, Karen did leave. One summer morning, a moving truck appeared in her driveway, and boxes were carried out with little ceremony. No neighbors came to say goodbye. No one offered to help. She loaded her life into that truck under the watchful eyes of the very tree she had tried to destroy. When the vehicle pulled away, the street seemed to exhale in relief, as though a storm had finally passed. Her house remained empty for a time, a silent shell of her former presence. When it was eventually sold, the new owners embraced the oak rather than resent it. They decorated their lawn with flowers, set up a bench beneath the tree, and told me how grateful they were to live beside something so beautiful. The contrast could not have been sharper, and so the story came full circle. My grandfather's tree, planted with love and care half a century ago, had not only endured, but had become the centerpiece of a saga that would be told for years. Karen's downfall had cemented the oak's place in history, not just in legal records, but in the hearts of the neighborhood. In the end, the oak did what it had always done. It stood tall, unyielding, and timeless. And Karen, who had once believed she could bend the world to her will, learned the hard way that some things are beyond her control. Because you can cut notes, file complaints, and swing saws in the dead of night, but you cannot uproot legacy. And my grandfather's oak, now stronger than ever, would stand long after her name was forgotten.